had a long-standing collaboration partnership with AUT. In particular, our mechanical engineering college, every summer, a cohort of students and professors from Wayne State will come to Hangzhou to take the whole global engineering course together with our CUC students. Dr. Eagle is a practicing expert innovator. In 2017, he has invited speakers to the U.S. Nation Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine to discuss the future of innovation and education. And the U.S. report of that meeting, branches from the same tree, was released in May 2018. Dr. Eagle had led over 40 executive teams in the Fortune 500 through coaching professors to develop an innovative mindset. In this work, he is a close collaborator with Jeff and Stanford, and founder and the CEO of the innovation in our MS. Dr. Eagle has a PhD in space engineering from the University of Michigan. In this talk, Dr. Eagle will explain his practicing philosophy of innovation and the need to fund the healthy new family if one makes getting the way are four aspects of innovation, gaining and the inherent conflict among them. He will describe how to build a culture of innovation by creating activation procedures. Also, ideas suggested by other authors and participants of innovation. Now, let's warmly welcome Dr. Eagle to give his speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do I need the microphone? Okay. So the talk today that I'm going to give is about conflict. And Michael and I were just talking at the very beginning, and he said, typically when we see something, innovation with now, it means creating better now, right? So I actually do think that we need to create better conflict. So not that we need more disharmony, but that conflict is actually a way of achieving a harmonious outcome. So just by a show of hands, how many people think that engineers are more creative than artists? We got one. Anybody else want to be brave? Couple? How many here are engineers? So what does everyone else do if you're not an engineer? What do you? Who is in the audience if they're not engineers? Is everyone an engineer?
I guess all of us work for engineers.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. They're just shy.
Yeah.
Does everybody want to stand up? No? Please, stand up. Come on. There's going to be some audience participation, and if you don't listen now, it's going to go downhill very quickly. So just stand up for 1 second. Ready? Very good. Very good. Thank you. We're going to stretch. It's late in the afternoon. Okay, you can sit back down. So actually, neuroscience says that late in the afternoon, it's hard for you to remember things unless you do some kind of physical activity. So the best way to engage your brain is to start every lecture with like 5 seconds of some kind of intensity physical activity, and your memory works better. Some of the lecture that I'm going to give today is available in book form. It's translated into Chinese. So this is co-author, you can't read this at the bottom, but Jeff DeGraff is an author in Coaching Creativity. And this textbook was published in the late 2000s and is available. So the work that I'm going to be talking about today is available here. So innovation in this framework is broken into 4 different ideas. And all of them are sort of equal in concept, but the key criteria here is they're not equal in tactic or in the timing that one needs them when you're practicing innovation. So typically in a different model or different framework for innovation, we would say that there are 4 archetypes, and in order for something to be good, we need all 4 of them all of the time. And actually, this model disagrees with that. So we say one type of innovation is the creation of something new, right? So new technology or new ideas. This is the most common when we say the word innovation. People think of new technology as sort of driving innovation. But there's 3 other types of innovation. Competition drives innovation by creating this race between 2 equal competitors. So trying to do something faster than someone else or right away allows you to compete with them. Competition, however, is in conflict with the collaborative form of innovation. So if you want to work together with someone, you can't quite compete with them. And if you want that collaborative innovation if you want something to last for a very, very long time, it often means that you need to bring everybody together and agree on how to move forward. So collaborative innovation and competitive innovation creates tension, right? So it creates the potential for disharmony. Similarly, the creative form of innovation, where you're doing things that are brand new, is oppositional to a control form of innovation, which says there's one correct way to do things. Taken together, the 4 of these innovative types are what we're calling the innovation genome, and it allows you to understand where and how to piece together different ideas to form innovation. So each of these different types of innovation we're going to personify in a person. And so the complete form of innovation we're going to call athletes. So people that aspire to compete often are going to thrive in very contentious environments. They're going to be very aggressive. Snack food markets and smartphones, right? So what happens when the new iPhone 10 comes out if you own an iPhone 8, right? The iPhone 8 essentially becomes a paperweight. It becomes old news, and the new smartphone is sort of the hot thing. Financial services company in the United States and other places are places where you see this kind of thing. United States college football, every season, 20% of the head coaches are fired for not performing as well as they could. In this area, we have market forces where speed and profit are most important, where prosperity and vitality are 2 words that we would use to describe this. And then there are 3 key characteristics of innovation that we're going to track here. One is the magnitude, so how much innovation. Because the momentum of the compete form or the athlete is so high, the momentum is medium and the sustainability is low, right? So it's very difficult to sustain this form of innovation because it's moving so quickly. So what you get in companies that have this form of innovation is very high turnover. You get people in for a very short amount of time, they spend all of their energy, and then they're sort of spent. So again, these are the athletes. Oppositional to that, we have sages. So the collaborative form of innovation focuses on cooperation, centers around shared belief systems and shared values. So you see a lot of maybe not-for-profit groups here, similar lifestyles where you want to create communities, so people that share hobbies and things. Bicycle lanes in the United States are a good way to sort of see some of this where you're sharing now. So in the United States, it's very uncommon to see bicycle lanes, but the idea is that you want to share the road with vehicles. The value systems of the clan and community, where you create a community of practice and a culture of development. So you really invest in training people rather than spending people like you would in the compete form. And you share a lot of knowledge. So universities are a good place to run into people that share this trait. You want to look for ways to find new knowledge by search and reapply. So if you exist in one form or one discipline, and you can bring your knowledge to a different discipline, we call that search and reapply. Capabilities. To develop capabilities, we typically see or encourage apprenticeship, where you find someone that's going to work for you. This is again very common in graduate education, where you have a number of graduate students who you're apprenticing, who are working closely with you, and you're sharing your knowledge with them. And again, around community, it's looking for family outings and tourist associations that you might participate with to find other people who are part of your plan. This form of innovation sustainability, by its nature, because it's communally oriented and culture driven, is very high. So it takes a long time. So the momentum to develop this form of innovation is often very slow. And the magnitude of these innovations are also sort of in the middle position. Now, the title of the talk discusses artists and engineers. So in the create form of innovation, we call these artists. Artists care most and foremost about doing things that have never been done before. So uniqueness, breakthrough innovations, miracle drugs, visual prosthetics, so a digital eyeball you might take as good examples, or things that are highly differentiated. So in America, we have a lot of craft beer. Actually in Detroit and Grand Rapids, taken together, there are more than 100 different breweries. So it's an incredible amount of variety that you're seeing. And fashion is a good example of this, where every 3 to 6 months there's a new cycle of work that's being created. A lot of these people are brought together in an ad hoc fashion. So the gig economy is a very good example of sort of a freewheeling conception of community. There's a discovery-based strategy, right, where you walk out, you don't necessarily have a concrete plan, you just know that you want to go somewhere and you'll experience things as you go. Radical experimentation, so sort of trying things that are very diverse, kind of pushing things outside of the limits. Looking for growth by speculating new markets, or setting aside a gambling fund, where you say, you know, I don't even really care if I lose this $1,000, I'm just going to try something new. There's a focus on creativity, where vision and expression are very important, so being able to do something that no one else is doing and that you sort of have ownership of. And again, there's a psychological and sort of spiritual exploration that tends to underlie the values of a lot of artists. Very high risk, very high magnitude of innovation, but it's not a slow form of innovation, it's sort of in between. Because of the pressure to create new things, there tends to be a medium amount of momentum. Now the opposite of the artist and sort of pushing at the interesting part of this talk, and what we all in this room tend to identify as, is the control form of innovation, which is the engineer. In the control form of innovation, we care much more about the predictability of things rather than their uniqueness. A good example of sort of the control form of innovation is McDonald's restaurant, where a sort of semi-literate person presses a button on a cash register, and sort of simultaneously a cow gets shot in Argentina, and everything in between sort of happens by magic, right? So the idea that it's very, very predictable, process-driven, where you can get to very large scale repeatably. So airline logistics is a good example of this. When a weather event or something unpredictable happens, it tends to throw these systems into disarray. People with this, engineers tend to be very cautious, so surgical procedures where things have to go correctly, you'll find people who have this type of innovation propensity. There tends to be a lot of hierarchy in these cultures, so people care a lot about who has what authority and have we gotten the right permissions to do what we're proposing to do. There's a lot of efficiency-driven, lean manufacturing and supply chain innovations are good examples of this type of innovation. Quality, where you have a total quality control system, or an end-to-end IT, again, where things are very well regulated and everything has to work. Engineers care mostly about the safety of the systems or savings, making efficiency improvements is a big one of the qualities of the engineer. And we care much more about productivity by measuring how much can be accomplished and how much can be advanced. So how measurable is the innovation? The innovation here tends to be very low risk, or it's been de-risked. It's been, we tend to understand how this is going to roll out. Momentum here is medium, but the magnitude, in order to make this change at scale, almost by definition, it has to be incremental change. So if we want radical change, there's going to be risk associated with that. And that's going to compete. So this high risk, high magnitude innovation is going to be the opposite form of innovation from low risk, low magnitude. So again, how do we know what to do and when? In this form of innovation competency, these are what are called S-curves. Almost all companies, almost all ideas tend to grow like this. They don't grow linearly, so they don't sort of incrementally advance over time. Often there tends to be actually negative growth. So you have to spend money up front, and you actually lose revenue before an idea gets to growth and sort of takes off. At the beginning of a company, and when it's first founded, it's typically founded around an idea by an artist. So we have somebody who has a very interesting new breakthrough that they want. Often what we see is that person wants to carry the idea through to fruition. Unfortunately, they're not very good at these other forms of scale. And so what we advocate for is trying to find people with oppositional or pairwise thinking, where a creative person can find somebody who cares about getting things done, so who can find an athlete. Do this handoff where somebody who's created the idea finds somebody who can run with it. Once you have a competitor, or you're in a competitive marketplace, you often need to find people who can join with you, who can bring people on board. So you might start marketing your idea to others. You might start selling your idea, trying to get people to buy in and join you. That's how you go from a competitive form where you're trying to beat everyone to a collaborative form where you're trying to bring people in with you. And that's when you start to see real growth, when people start to buy into your ideas. Eventually your idea gets to such a scale that you need to start reducing variation. You need to start increasing the process efficiency because you want to increase revenues. Unfortunately, what we see here is a company becomes so large or so well established that they start to lose their ability to innovate because they stop doing things that are new. And so what happens then when the engineer who's trying to reduce variation, reduce the amount of new products, reduce the amount of new ideas in a company, meets with an artist in that company who says, we need to be going to do the next thing, to create new ideas. What do you think happens here? Does everybody get along and we shut down the old company and start with a new idea and everybody jumps on board with something new? No. What happens here, what Joseph Schumpeter is an economist from the 1950s, he calls this tipping point creative destruction. And it's where new innovation comes in and essentially cuts the legs out from underneath an existing organization, because it's rare that existing organizations figure out how to change the culture where maybe 80% or 90% of your employees have been hired at this stage to do this thing, and new ideas are fledgling, right? They're 10% time. So in Google speak, if you're familiar with Google, they allow their employees 10% of their time to go do kind of radical stuff. So they've hired engineers, and then they've told engineers to go be artists 10% of the time. It's very difficult to do that because you've been trained your whole life to be an engineer. Instead, what we'd like to see is 90% of your people having this job function, and 10% of your people having this job function, finding a way to have those two groups of people meet and talk, creatively and constructively. So maybe you came to this talk today and you're asking yourself, well, how is this going to be effective for me? How am I going to put this into practice in my own life? What can I do if the dean of the college wants everybody to become more innovative? How do we do that? How is that possible? So an engineer typically is working within limits, right? We're very good at constraining ourselves and defining the constraints that we work within. Artists tend to thrive in environments where the work is unconstrained, where there are no constraints, there are no limits, where you can do whatever you want. If you're an engineer and you want to work innovatively, typically we have to find and do the exact opposite of what we've been coached to do our entire lives. And this tends to make people very uncomfortable. Artists, on the other hand, tend to have to narrow their scope and figure out, how can I add some constraints to this? So, does anybody here think that they typify what we would call an artist? There's usually, so at any point, it's not that you have to be any one of these exclusively. You are going to embody different forms of innovation at different points in your life, and different careers that you might take on. Again, I said, if you're university faculty, many of you probably feel like you're sages or collaborators, more so than you are artists or engineers. But for this activity, I'd like you to figure out if you want to wear an engineer hat. How many people would like to wear an engineer hat today? It's okay to participate. A couple of you. I need about half the room to be engineers. So if you think you might be an engineer, think about, can you find somebody who wants to be the opposite type of engineer from you? Who wants to be an artist? How many people would like to be artists? I got one. So the three of you are going to participate together, and everyone else is going to have nothing to do, which is going to be very sad. Okay, as we go, so there's going to be a break every 10 minutes or so, where I want you to find somebody sitting next to you and talk with them. If you don't know them, introduce yourself. And we're going to talk about these three different steps, which is, how can I personally implement innovation, more innovation in my life? Typically, because these two forms of innovation compete with each other, there's an American expression that we call playing the devil's advocate, which means being an oppositional thinker on purpose, just to spark conflict or to create discussion. And it's often the case, like I said, that how you naturally operate, in order to do something or suggest experiments that are really radical, what you have to do is figure out how to do the exact opposite of what you think you should do. So what I tend to ask people is, think of an idea that you're certain will fail. Because a lot of people are sure of themselves. They know bad ideas when they see them. Right? So it's often very difficult to pick out the best ideas. But it's relatively straightforward to pick out ideas that you know are bad. But it's in those ideas that you know are bad that are hidden innovations. That if you can figure out what is in this idea that I disagree with, who might agree with this idea? And this is where the idea of conflict between engineers and artists generates constructive conflict. So I like philosophers. So Joseph Schumpeter was an economist. Arthur Schopenhauer is a mid-19th century, early 20th century philosopher. And he says that every man takes the limits of his own field of vision for the limits of the world. In the context of artists and engineers, this typically means that the dominant logic you use, or the type of innovations that you see, are the only types of innovations that you see. The American idiom for this is, if you have a hammer, all the world's problems look like nails, right? And so if you take one type of thinking and you try and apply it everywhere, you're actually limiting yourself. So there are 3 steps to implementing strategy. The first is figuring where are we at. This is essentially what your GPS is doing to give you directions, right? Which is how to turn the strategy of I want to go somewhere into concrete steps. First, figure out where you're at. Next, ask, well, where would you like to be? And then the third step, that's often self-evident, but perhaps not, is asking, well, how do we get there? So, where are we at? Zhejiang University of Technology, where are we at? We want to be more innovative. We're not as innovative as we'd like to be. Where are we at? So each of you can figure out for yourself, if you're trying to think of in an area, you can set an intention for yourself. Think of something, think of a problem that you brought into the room with you today, and ask yourself, where are you at with that problem? Maybe your kid is misbehaving at home. Maybe you really love your job and you want to figure out how you can get promoted, right? Think about where you're at. And then we're going to talk about a couple of strategies. So I lectured a class in Detroit in January where we had students work on self-directed projects. So in place of giving a final exam, I asked the students to work on a passion project. The common conception for this is called a genius hour. So I asked all the students to think about what they would really like to do. Rather than what I wanted them to do, I asked them to write a 1-page statement about what they were going to do, that they wanted to do, and how it related to the course topic that I was teaching. And I brought some quotes from the students who were reflecting on how they had experienced that class. What were the key learnings that they had when they were given a self-directed project? This is one of them. I've always had an interest in how things work, but I've always needed someone to force me to do something before I actually go and do it. Right? So this is a very common way. If you're a control or an engineering education, somebody says, go do this, and you go do it. And they say, go do that, and you go do it. And so this person had been trained, they had been acculturated to only doing something when they were told. Well, that's nonsense. I wish I could have realized that earlier, because I feel like I could have excelled if I had just tried harder or started sooner. And so this student was a middling student, C student, not someone who, when I first met them, I thought, wow, this student really is impressive. But at the end of this class, he blew me away, because he had worked on something and gone above and beyond, because it was a passion project that he had. It was something that he actually was invested in and cared a lot about. This is another student's reflection. So he's talking about being an engineer. Be curious about why things work. It's this curiousness that I think drives most of us to be engineers. Why and how do things work, and how can we apply this in new ways? There's a ton of literature out there with many answers. So read, read, read. So we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but part of what the mode that I was asking students to learn in, rather than sitting passively for them to receive information from me, was to take ownership, to learn what they wanted, create something, and then be willing to share it. So that's a mode of teaching that I like to call learn, create, share. It's similar to kindergarten, where you bring in something from home, and we used to call that show and tell. So show and tell, we did a lot of show and tell in class. And students would go be curious when they were given the authority to bring something into the classroom that they wanted to share. They would typically be much more excited and much more engaged, and they would share with each other things that they were learning, rather than waiting for me to tell them what they needed to learn next. So I think I've said this already, but when we're trying to figure out where we're at, this is a potential point of conflict. It's a potential stumbling block, right? And that's that our dominant logic determines what we see and what we don't. So if I'm wearing an engineer hat, I tend to see other engineers and see engineering problems. I don't tend to see where I need to remove constraints because I'm comfortable with the constraints. The constraints make me feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. And if I want to be innovative, I often have to go into places where I feel uncomfortable. Now the key is to go into places not where you feel so uncomfortable that you can't function. That would be dysfunctional. But you want to find healthy unfamiliarity. So traveling to a new country, healthy unfamiliarity, right? Finding a place where you can experience something new and try and understand or get some perspective on your dominant logic. Ways to get perspective on your dominant logic is often to ask colleagues, how do I behave? Am I an artist, an engineer, a sage, or an athlete? And using that information to help you find people with different perspectives. If I want to figure out where I'm at, if I can put something up in the air that gives me a better perspective or a higher point of view, that can be very useful, right? So if I want to understand where I am in relation to my problem or in relation to others who have had similar problems, moving far away tends to give us a different perspective, a different logic, right? I'm a big fan of Carl Sagan, and the Voyager probe in the 1970s was headed out past Jupiter. And Carl Sagan actually got in a fight with NASA scientists because he told them to turn the Voyager around and take a picture backwards. Not at the Jovian satellites that they had been programmed. The mission was to go to Jupiter and photograph the moons of Jupiter, and then on to Saturn. And they were passing Saturn, and they had already taken all the photos that they needed to. And the NASA scientists said, why should we turn the thing around? There's nothing there. We're not going to see anything. And if you're familiar with this photo, it's iconic. And there's one of Saturn's rings. And in the middle of Saturn's ring is a pale blue dot. And actually the name of that photograph is the pale blue dot. And it's a photograph of the Earth from the perspective of Saturn. And Carl Sagan has a beautiful quote. He says, every human being that's ever lived, every person that you've ever known exists on this tiny blue speck. Which is a great example of how taking a higher point of view can sort of change your perspective. Now, conversely, or contradicting that previous statement, instead of going high, you can also go low. So sometimes you need to go beneath the surface and observe subtle distinctions. You need to figure out, how do you feel about things? A practice that I put into place for myself about 6 years ago was I gave up using an alarm clock in the morning. So rather than setting an alarm at 6:30 and trying to wake up at 6:30 and be productive, I just woke up naturally whenever the sun would come up or whenever I felt like it. It gave me this ability to observe subtle changes that would happen inside, right? So rather than having a stimulus response where a bell would go off and I would have to get up out of bed, I would have to ask myself every morning, is this the time that I want to get up? And if I was feeling sick that day, right, I would be much more in tune with how was I feeling right at the moment that I was waking up. And I sort of fell in love with it, right? So in order to get up at 6 o'clock every day, I have to go modify much of my life, right? It's now focused around getting to bed on time, because if I don't, there's no way I'm going to be at work when I should. It's become an interesting habit that I've adopted, but it's really radically changed my perspective on almost everything. So I set a lot of intentions based on how am I feeling about this, and being in touch with how I feel, rather than waiting for some other thing to alert me to change. And the last thing that's important about figuring out where you're at is that you have imperfect information. So you might think you know exactly where you're at, and you might be dead wrong, because there's an important piece of information that you're simply missing. You might need to go talk to a mentor or an advisor who can give you better, who can see where you're at better than you can. Again, because our dominant logic, the way that we see the world, changes based on our perspective. And finding people with different perspectives than ourselves can help triangulate where we are. So again, thinking around the model, if we think that we know where we're at, it's probably a bad idea to find 3 other engineers who can confirm where we're at, because they're going to have the same biases and they're going to look at the world through the same lens that we do. Being an engineer, though, we also have access to a lot of useful metaphor. So triangulation is a useful metaphor because if you want to get higher accuracy on the position of where you're at, you want to find 3 perspectives that are sort of spread out, right? Not co-located. And so if you can find perspectives from a collaborator or from an artist or from an athlete to really try and figure out where are you, that will help. Okay, audience participation time. First thing to do is think to yourself, which of those 4 strategies resonates with you? Do you disagree with any of the 4 strategies? And were there any opposites? And I'm going to give you 2 minutes to talk to somebody that you're sitting with and see if you can come to some consensus about this. And when 2 minutes is up, the slide should move automatically, and that'll let you know that we're going to move on. So, if anybody wants to come talk to me, I'll be available for 2 minutes. Otherwise, talk to a partner. Ready, set, go.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. If you would like to translate it to Chinese, then maybe
Sure,
that.
yes, I will. 各位老师，我首先想说一句，谢谢大家。这么忙，期末也是搬家过程中，我就替这位老师谢谢。他就是说，工程师跟艺术家，谁更有创造？现在他叫大家跟隔壁的邻居谈一下，发现一些什么东西没有共识，然后找到完全不同的想法，好像。Did you agree with what? Any? Okay.
Any of the 4 slides.
Okay.
These 4.
Oh. Okay. Okay.
So you have to remember one,
Okay.
talk to a partner.
Okay. Number 1 of what?
1 or 2
Number 2 of
of
what?
those 4.
Number 4. Okay. 他的意思是，就是说，我其实没有很理解他，就是说，这个工作到一定程度，需要创造力，就跟别人谈，发现不同的事情，要试图去找不同的东西去争取。I tried my best, but I do really not sure if I accurate.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
We don't need to be accurate. The whole purpose is to talk to someone else about what you've heard or what you think.
Yeah.
Share our perspective with somebody sitting next to you
Yeah.
for 2 minutes.
Okay. Very much. I try to talk to Michael.
What do you think? So, once we figure out where we're at with innovation, where we think we are, what problems we might have, what changes we'd like to make, we have to ask ourselves, okay, I know where I'm at, well, where do I want to be? So, the conversation that I had was around the Chinese education system, having a very regimented control over everything, right? In the US, we would call this ABET, the Accreditation Board for Engineering and Technology, I think. And there's no room in that process for innovation, for artistry, for creation. That makes it very difficult to prove to the engineer, the people who are very process-driven, that innovation needs to happen. But I think in the undergraduate lab that you have, there's a big poster on the wall that looks like it's from the college here about innovation. And so if we know that innovation is driven through new processes and new technologies and doing things in new ways, but the systems that we have in place are not adaptable, they don't admit this creativity, it's hard to get where we want to go. So quickly, where do we want to be? Again, these are reflections from students who went through the classroom that I taught, where we use some of these methodologies. So, some of you in this room, I feel like, maybe reflect this student's perspective. I was very hesitant to trust the methods that Dr. Eagle set forth to learn in this class. I didn't trust my peers to put forth the needed effort to teach me the way I believed I was teaching them. So in my classroom, we spent a lot of time with students trying to explain their understanding of the material to each other so that they could deepen their own knowledge, their own expertise of the material. I did not trust that my peers cared about this as much as I did, right? So everybody brings their own perspectives to the class, and when I ask them to share with each other, often the students who are very engaged, A students, A-typified students, hated sitting next to the D students because they didn't feel like the D students were trying. They didn't feel like the D students cared. I believe my biggest accomplishment for this class was the ability to trust my peers more. To trust that when I sit and talk to someone for 5 seconds or 5 minutes, that actually that deepens my understanding, my learning is improved when I simply explain or listen to someone else explain something back to me. So, when we're trying to figure out where we want to be, we run into a number of stumbling blocks as engineers. The first of which is, there's no data on the future where these innovations are happening. As engineers, we want to be able to quantify, we want to be able to measure, we want to be able to determine the veracity of something that's new, that's never been tried before. And that's impossible. I forgot that I had a microphone. So, if you want to do something new, and you need data on how effective it is, you're never going to do something new. So you have to be given the gambler's wage. Somebody has to be willing to take a bet on you and wait for the return. They also have to be willing to take a bet on you, and if you fail, it was a small bet, right? They can't bet the farm, but they should be able to bet a little bit. If I want to figure out where to go, a really effective way to do that is to go there for a little while, right? I don't necessarily want to move my family to a new place as a test, but I would vacation there and visit there, see the practices that are in place, and bring that information back. If I want to innovate, I can search for those innovations in other disciplines, and then come back to my discipline and apply them there. Setting a goal is often more important than actually achieving that goal, because it gives you something to direct your efforts towards. But you have to understand that there are always going to be missing pieces. The puzzle the vision that you have will often not fully realize. There will be pieces that will be missing. If you've ever assembled a 1,000-piece puzzle on vacation or when you have some free time, it's infuriating to me when I go somewhere, when I travel somewhere, and I start to put together a puzzle, and then I realize that one of the puzzle pieces is missing. Right? It somehow makes the entire experience feel fruitless, even though it's the purpose of assembling a puzzle is not really the finished product, right? It's the process that you're going through in assembling a puzzle. And finally, the most important part of creating a vision for where you want to be is that people tend to not resist their own creativity. The stumbling block that innovators come to is that they have created the entire meal, they've finished the product, and they bring that finished product to a food critic for the food critic to say, this is garbage, I don't like this, right? In the United States, we have a restaurant called Mongolian Barbecue, where you walk up and you assemble your own meal, and then they cook it in front of you. And the people ahead of you in line and the people behind you in line clearly have no idea what they're doing, because you've made the best meal ever in the line of Mongolian Barbecue. The irony, of course, is that the person ahead of you and behind you in line looks at your meal and says, I would never eat that. So if you want to figure out where you want to be, often you're going to have to enroll people that also have something to say about where you're going. And if you forget that, if you only ask yourself how to create a vision for where the future is, you'll miss out on this important piece of people want to contribute. They want to feel like whatever you're doing that they can take credit for, or they can be responsible for, or they can say, I supported that initiative. And so asking for people's advice or input on how can we make this better along the way is an important part of showing them that their creativity is actually embedded in whatever product or process it is that you're creating. We can do the same thing around where we want to be. I'm going to skip this because I think I'm running out of time, and I want to talk about how do we get there. How am I doing on time? Okay. So, when you want to figure out, so this, again, these are 2 student reflections from this course where I asked them to pick a passion project and go try things without a lot of me scaffolding what they were up to. And this student said he would advise his former self, his earlier self, not to be afraid to fail. That you will learn a lot more if you fall, get up and keep trying, than if you shoot for something minimal from the start. Right? So recall that the engineering mindset looks for these incremental innovations. They look for the smallest improvement that we can make. Whereas the artist looks for big vision, right? Tries to really stretch. A self-directed project offers the opportunity to learn a significant amount about yourself, not only about the topic that you're studying, but about how you learn and your work ethic. Of course, no one likes to fail or do poorly, and it sometimes crushes people. I know I've fallen into this trap where I set myself up to try and learn something and I don't do well, and then I pretend like I never tried it in the first place. But when you can push through that, you learn that you can accomplish a lot more than you had previously thought possible. So I was really encouraged by the number of sort of who I would have considered middle of the road students based on their GPA or based on just their conversation ability. But when they wrote things like this in their self-reflections, I had to wonder, is the student simply telling me what I want to hear? Or has he actually changed his way of thinking because of this project? And this is the last student response. This class has definitely opened my eyes to the fact that failure isn't a bad thing, but rather an opportunity for success. So Henry Ford's famous for saying, your failure is simply an opportunity to try again, having learned something. It allows you to learn from your mistakes so you don't repeat them in the future. right? So creating a classroom environment where students feel like they can fail and learn. Actually, failure is part of the learning process. If the only thing you're doing in a classroom is demonstrating your knowledge, you've learned somewhere else, and you're simply coming to that classroom with the information you've already learned and applying it. It's safe to say that the unconventionality of this course has tremendously increased my ability to learn and retain information. So I started off the class by quizzing everybody of the material that they were supposed to learn the last semester. Things in thermodynamics, in mechanics of materials, and the students failed miserably. They weren't able to use memory recall and tell me about the concepts they had learned, because they had simply memorized them for the test, and then after those routines were over, they had forgotten it. This style of creation, so again, the mantra of learn, create, share. When you create new information from the material that you've learned, it embeds in your head in a different way. The neuroscience on this is clear, that when I memorize and regurgitate information, it's like I've been spoon-fed. Somebody shows me a buffet, shows me the Mama Mongolian barbecue, but they're assembling the dish for me, and I'm not that excited to eat it. If I'm creating my own meal, I have to have embedded the concepts that beef and onion and broccoli goes good together, and I have to think about that. This style of learning isn't for everyone, and in fact, I would say that it's not for every class either, right? We need some classes that are large lecture format, where people are delivering instruction. But we also need 10% time, where students can get self-directed projects. In fact, I didn't even enjoy it at first, right? So many students will resist. They will not be on board at first. In fact, it caused a lot of stress in the beginning of the course before I began to appreciate the flexible structure of learning. So, as educators, we have to be courageous. We have to know in our heads, in principle, that what we're asking the students to do is good for them, right? It's like being a mom. You know what's good for your kids, even though they fight you and they don't want to do it. You have to be brave yourself in knowing that some of these ideas and these methods work better than the traditional lecture. So how do we get there? Remembering that how we create information tends to be what we create. So that means if we put on our engineer hats and we engineer the syllabus for a class, that class is going to replicate engineering mindsets. If we put on our artist hat and we create a class that has a lack of constraints, if we figure out a portion of our classroom time that can be unconstrained, we allow for artists in that classroom to create things that are new. There is I would say, a wave of multitasking that has swept at least the United States, where people think that they can be good multitaskers, that means that you're being productive or efficient. The research on this says the exact opposite, that in fact, the easiest way to sort of figure this out is to recite the alphabet to yourself, just in order, right? So something like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K. And then do the same thing with numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's monotasking, asking your brain to recall one piece of similar information. Multitasking is something like A, 1, B, 2, C, 3. Switching between cognitive tasks tends to slow us down. So if we want to figure out how to get there, we want to spend time doing just one thing at a time, until we can determine whether or not that one thing is as successful as we'd like it to be. Where people tend to get tripped up is putting too much emphasis on this one experiment at the very beginning. And so, if we start to spend time monotasking, and something fails, we have to allow for this fact that we can't really avoid it. We can only accelerate and learn from it. The hardest thing to do when we fail is to recognize, though, that sometimes failure really does mean failure. It doesn't mean that we should pick up and try again. It means that we're not good at this, and we need to stop and start doing something else. So one of the keys to innovation, again, is sometimes in order to create the capacity to innovate, we have to stop doing something that we're currently doing that we think is important. We have to stop a current practice in order to find flexibility and the ability, the capacity to do something different. So if you want to innovate, if you want to find time in your own lives to innovate, you have to stop doing something that you're already doing. I was on the plane flying over here, and I sat down next to a woman, and she was late, middle-aged, and was talking about how I started chit-chatting with her, and she said that she was really interested in writing a book. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Tell me about your book. I also have aspirations to write. We can talk about writing. And she said, well, I haven't really, I'm not that far. And I was pressing her, and she said, oh, well, I haven't started it, actually. It's like, oh, well, why not? And she rattled off this, she was going to Pilates and working with friends, and what she hadn't realized is that if she really wants to write a book, if she wants to create something new, she has to prioritize. She has to stop doing something that she's currently doing in order to make room for this thing that she says that she wants. So when an artist and an engineer meet and we want to ask which of those two is more creative, it's not that we can't know that answer a priori, but I'd like to suggest that whoever can get out of their own way and recognize that the other person is bringing something useful to the table and start to build a bridge to that person to figure out how they can bring them along. That person, in my opinion, the collaborator, is doing the more innovative work. Oppositional thinking can often deadlock us. So if we find somebody who disagrees with us, who has a perspective that's different, it's important not to get stuck in that conflict. This is the double-edged sword of diversity, right? So if I bring together a room full of people who have different opinions, hopefully the purpose of the meeting is to figure out what shared goals that we have, and not simply to look at the differences that everyone brings to the table and highlight those differences. We have to practice balancing strength with flexibility. Many people that spend all their time working out in the gym, they get very, very strong. People that go do yoga get very, very flexible. But often we need both. It's not simply strength or flexibility at any given time that's important. It's the ability to identify, when do I need strength? When do I need to be flexible? Bordering on contradiction. This sentence seems like a contradiction. But the opposite of every truth is also true. I think the truth in this sentence lies when you realize that the truths that we all have, that we carry with us, there is someone in the world for whom that truth is false. And it's understanding and recognizing that the people that we might disagree with most strongly tend to be the people who, if we spend time with, we learn the most from. So everything and everyone has something to teach us. I hope that we all walk through life kind of with that humility and look for ways that people and experiences can teach us new things. And that when we find those conflicts, that we find growth through constructive conflict and in healthy unfamiliarity. Thanks for your time. I'll be happy to take questions, and it's been my pleasure to be here and provide some sort of my perspective. So thank you very much.